Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the nomination of Judge Neil Gorsuch to serve as an Associate Justice on the United States Supreme Court. After meeting with the nominee, carefully reviewing his record and questioning him during his confirmation hearing, I've come to the conclusion that elevating Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court's bench would merely guarantee more of the same from the Roberts Court, a sharply divided, already activist court that routinely sides with powerful corporate interests over the rights of average Americans. Mr. President, I think it's important to start by acknowledging just exactly how it is that Judge Gorsuch came to be before the Senate, namely this body's failure to fulfill one of its core functions. Immediately following the death of Justice Scalia, in a move as cynical as it was irresponsible, Senate Republicans announced that they would not move forward with filling the vacancy until after the presidential election, before President Obama had even named a nominee. The majority leader said, quote, "The American people should have a voice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice." The only problem with the majority leader's reasoning was that the American people did have a voice in the decision. They had voted to make President Obama President of the United States. But Senate Republicans had a difficult time justifying their obstruction. That is, until they decided to mischaracterize a speech delivered by former Judiciary Committee Chairman Joe Biden in June of 1992. In that speech, then Senator Biden discussed the possibility of a Supreme Court justice. This is in June of 1992. The possibility of a justice resigning in an election year in order to ensure that a president of the same party could name a replacement. Under those circumstances, he said the president should refrain from nominating a replacement and the Senate should not hold confirmation hearings until after the election. My Republican colleagues seized upon this portion, this small portion of Senator Biden's speech, and dubbed it the Biden rule. Chairman Grassley said the Senate ought to abide by the Biden rule, which he said holds that there are, quote, no presidential Supreme Court nominations in an election year. The majority leader said, quote, as Chairman Grassley and I declared, the Senate will continue to observe the Biden rule so that the American people have a voice in this momentous decision. So in order to justify a truly unprecedented act of obstruction, my Republican colleagues pointed to the so-called Biden rule and said they were standing on principle. That was the principle. But my Republican colleagues chose to overlook a few important details. First of all, the scenario Senator Biden described in his 90-minute speech was not the situation that our country faced last year. No one strategically resigned last year. A justice died. No one dies to game the system. And second, my Republican, and most importantly, my Republican colleagues ignored the actual point that Senator Biden made in that speech. If they had bothered to read the entire speech, or I suspect they actually had, they would have found that further down, Senator Biden said, quote, and this is important. This is what Senator Biden said in the speech that was used as the justification not to take up Merrick Garland. Senator Biden said in that speech, quote, if the president, then George H.W. Bush, if the president consults and cooperates with the Senate or moderates his selections absent consultation, then his nominee may enjoy my support, as did Justices Kennedy and Souter. Allow me, Mr. President, to dwell on that for a moment. Senator Biden said that if a Supreme Court vacancy arose during an election year and the president consulted with the Senate or absent consultation put forward a moderate consensus candidate, that candidate should enjoy the support of the Judiciary Committee's chairman. That's the Biden rule. That's the Biden rule. If Senate Republicans had actually followed the Biden rule, we wouldn't be here today. Merrick Garland would be sitting on the Supreme Court bench. Judge Garland was supremely well qualified for the job. Here's a guy who was his high school's valedictorian, who attended Harvard College on a scholarship. Judge Garland was the right choice at the right time. He wasn't a partisan warrior or a partisan animal, a political animal. He was a judge's judge, and everyone knew it. That's why my Republican colleagues had to hide behind new and misleading so-called rules in order to deny him a hearing and a vote. Judge Gorsuch is no Merrick Garland. Judge Gorsuch is a creature of politics. Now, that's not what Judge Gorsuch told me when I met him earlier this year. I asked Judge Gorsuch if he was bothered by the way the Senate treated Merrick Garland, and he responded by telling me that he said, I try to stay away from politics. But documents that the Judiciary Committee received from the Department of Justice, including emails between Judge Gorsuch and Bush administration officials, show that Judge Gorsuch was very heavily involved in politics. A resume that he sent to President Bush's political director in November 2004, back when Judge Gorsuch was looking for a job, detailed his work on Republican political campaigns dating back to 1976 and highlighted an award he had received from Senate Republicans for his work to advance President Bush's judicial nominees. Now understand, being politically active or being a Republican are not disqualifying characteristics in a Supreme Court nominee, at least not in my book. But Judge Gorsuch's resume is relevant here because, contrary to what he told me, his resume establishes that he's not just intimately familiar with politics, he knows the politics of the judicial nominations process, and he knows it well. My Republican colleagues, what they want is a results-oriented judge. Why else would they hold open a seat on the Supreme Court bench? Why else would they turn to the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society for candidates? Why else would they trample on the traditions of the Senate? What my Republican colleagues really want is a judge who will vote with their team. And that's the judge they'll get by confirming Neil Gorsuch. That's what this is all about. That's what this is about. Unlike Merrick Garland, Judge Gorsuch has little interest in reaching consensus or in deciding cases narrowly. Now, Judge Gorsuch took great pains to paint himself as a mainstream nominee. He pointed out that the 10th Circuit ruled unanimously 97% of the time, and that he was in the majority 99% of the time. But that's not unusual, and it doesn't provide any insight into his approach to being a judge. Judge Gorsuch is a results-oriented judge, and his record demonstrates that he approaches cases with a very specific outcome in mind. Contrary to what my Republican colleagues would have you believe, he doesn't hide that judicial philosophy, whether it's his concurrence in Hobby Lobby or his dissent in Trans Am trucking. Judge Gorsuch wears that philosophy on his sleeve, and it only underscores a disturbing pattern of siding with corporate interests over average Americans. In one 5-4 decision after another, we have seen the Roberts Court go out of its way to answer questions not before it, to overturn precedents, to strike down laws enacted by Congress, and to do all of this at great cost to consumers and to workers, to small businesses, and to middle-class Americans. And I think it's important to understand the extent to which he shares Justice Scalia's views. And Judge Gorsuch's record demonstrates that he is, in President Trump's words, a judge, quote, very much in the mold of Justice Scalia. During his time on the 10th Circuit, Judge Gorsuch has consistently ruled in favor of powerful interests. He sided with corporations over workers, corporations over consumers, and corporations over women's health. A study published in the Minnesota Law Review found that the Roberts Court is the most pro-corporate Supreme Court since World War II. And if the Senate confirms him, Judge Gorsuch guarantee more of the same from the Roberts Court. And I don't believe that's a court that our country can continue to afford. So I oppose Judge Gorsuch's nomination. I urge my colleagues to take a close look at his record of siding with powerful corporate interests over average Americans, to consider carefully how he stands to impact the court, and to reject his nomination. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I've listened over the last several weeks to accusations and a type of a smear campaign, quite frankly, against a good judge and a good man, Neil Gorsuch. It's remarkable to me to see that the debate has become more about character destruction than it has been about policy differences. I understand that there are policy differences. But why does it have to become to this? In the past few weeks, I've heard on this floor that Neil Gorsuch shouldn't be a justice on the Supreme Court because he has no independence from President Trump. Number two, I've heard he was handpicked by far-right groups like the Federalist Society, a group of legal minds committed to the original interpretation of the Constitution. Clearly, a scandalous group of radicals. I've heard that Judge Gorsuch supports torture. He's against privacy. He hates truckers. He'll step on the little guy, and he'll only help big corporations, and he's just not mainstream. And I've heard that he shouldn't be selected because he was not approved first by the Democratic Senate leadership. All of these reasons have been given for a historic change in Senate tradition, not to give a Supreme Court justice an up or down vote, block him on a procedural motion. For the first time ever, block a Supreme Court justice on a procedural motion with a partisan vote. So let me take these just one at a time as I walk through this. Number one, I heard constantly, he's not independent enough from President Trump. Now, as far as I know, he had never even met President Trump before. This doesn't seem to be a standard to be independent from the current sitting president. Let me give you an example of this. Justice Elena Kagan, clearly qualified as a legal mind, but I would tell you Republicans have serious policy differences with her. Though Justice Kagan was allowed to be able to have an up or down vote. This body did not have a standard that they have to be independent from the president. If they would have had a standard like that, Justice Kagan would never be on the bench. Why do I say that? Well, on May the 10th, 2010, President Obama nominated Elena Kagan to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. From 1997 to 1999, she served as the Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy and Deputy Director for Domestic Policy Council for President Clinton. In 2009, she was confirmed Solicitor General of the United States for President Obama. She worked for President Obama in the Obama White House as his Solicitor General, and then was taken directly out of the White House and put onto the Supreme Court. I would say that's not independent from the president. So this mythological new standard that any court justice nominee needs to be independent from the president clearly wasn't in place when Elena Kagan was being heard. Second issue that came up often was he was handpicked by far-right groups. There were all these groups that handpicked him, and so somehow that made it horrible that these different groups would actually try to support him. Well, it's interesting. I go back again to Justice Kagan. That wasn't the standard at that time again, and I could use numerous judges through that process. Elena Kagan was supported by the AFL-CIO, by the Human Rights Campaign, by numerous environmental groups like Wild Earth Guardians and Sierra Club, National Organization for Women. She had a lot of different liberal or progressive groups that were very outspoken in support in helping push her nomination. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. She was a nominee that was actively engaged in White House politics. She was actively engaged in Democratic campaigns before that, as far back as working for the Dukakis campaign. She was a Democratic activist, and it was well known. That did not preclude her from getting an up or down vote for the Supreme Court because she is sitting on the Supreme Court today. There was no cloture vote mandate or requirement for a 60-vote threshold, as there was pushed by this minority. This issue of somehow you can be handpicked or that you would have some groups that would support you from the outside, that somehow precludes you from being a serious consideration, is not legitimate, and everyone knows it. I've also heard the individuals out there saying, he's for torture, he's against privacy, he hates truckers, he'll step on the little guy, he's only for big corporations, he's not mainstream. Here's the problem. When you actually look at the history, it comes very different than that. Of the 2,700 cases that Judge Gorsuch has been involved in the 10 and a half years he's been on the 10th Circuit, he's been overturned with his opinions once. Once in 2,700 cases. 97% of the time, his cases were settled unanimously. 99% of the time, he voted with the majority. And unless you don't know the 10th Circuit, like we know the 10th Circuit in Oklahoma because they are the circuit court for our state, the majority of the judges on the 10th Circuit are judges selected by President Carter, President Clinton, and President Obama. They hold the majority in the 10th Circuit. It is interesting to me that Judge Gorsuch came and offered to meet with 100 senators one-on-one, face-to-face. Only 80 of them accepted his offer. 20 of them refused to even meet with him face-to-face. He's a solid jurist. I believe he'll do a good job. And in the time I sat down in his office and we looked at each other face-to-face, and I went through multitudes of hard questions with him, trying to determine his judicial philosophy, seeking one simple thing. Will you interpret the law as the law? Not with personal opinion, but as the law. This body is about opinions. This body is about listening to the voices all across our states and trying to make good policy. Across the street at the Supreme Court, it's about one thing. What does the law say, and what did it mean when it was written? Constitution and laws are not living documents. Now, they do live in the sense that if you want to have changes in the Constitution, you amend the Constitution and you make changes to it. But you can't suddenly say it meant one thing one day, but culture has changed and now it means something new. If you need new law, this body passes new law. Across the street, they read the law and just say, what does it mean? It's that straightforward. And I look forward to having a jurist on the Supreme Court as an associate justice that says, I may not even like all my opinions, and you may not like all my opinions, but I'm going to follow the law. And what the law says, that's what we're going to do. I think that's the best that we could ask from a Supreme Court justice. And I think it's a fair way to be able to get him an up or down vote. And I have to tell you, I'm profoundly disappointed that the Senate, to get a simple up or down vote, had to go through all of this just to be able to do what we've always done. Regardless of background or preferences or policy or politics, this body has always said the president, for his nomination, should get an up or down vote when they go through the process. We're going to do that tomorrow. And we'll put Judge Gorsuch on the bench. And we're ready for him to go to work. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.